Hello everyone, and welcome to the series on C++ programming, where we're going to be going through starting off with the basics of C++ programming, in particular the syntax, common functions, common structures, and so on. And then we're going to move on to the intermediate and advanced topics, and also create some applications in the process. So in this video, what I want to talk about is the basics associated to a first C++ program that most people usually start with, to sort of give you some comfortability with the syntax associated to the C++ programming environment. So of course we're going to start off with programs that are definitely a little bit more smaller compared to some larger programs such as video games. But typically a good practice when you are writing code is to comment your code out with these green statements. So in this world of C++ programming, if you want to create a comment to either one, communicate to yourself, because when you code things, sometimes you leave and then come back. You don't want to forget what you were doing. Or you want to sort of collaborate with others when you're writing code. So you sort of need to sort of explain what this function, what this method, what the structure is doing, or what its purpose is. And there's many reasons why some people would want to include comments. So to include a single line comment, you just need to start off with a double forward slash, and then everything after the compiler will not be able to see. So literally I can create another comment here, for example, and say, how are you doing? This has no effect on the actual program, aside from maybe the size by an argumentative small amount, right? But nonetheless, comments will not change, generally speaking, how your computer program will run. So the very first thing that you may see here, and this is usually the base structure of a C++ program, is this area here, where it starts off with int, which is short for integer, and then main, M-A-I-N, open close parentheses. So if you're familiar with some basic functions in math, main is sort of where your compiler, or the thing that is going to run your program and sort of put it together, is going to look first. So it's going to look like, so for example, I'm working in Visual Studio 2022, and what it does is it looks for this main function. And it sort of builds everything starting here, or at least it's defaulted that way. So the reason why we put this int here is because, as I said before, this is a function. So typically for a function, you give it some information and then it gives you something back, i.e. you give it some inputs, either one or more, and it's going to give you an output. Since it has to be a function by default, mainly the main function is just going to do what's inside of this main function and nothing more. We're going to be defaulting it to be an integer, therefore we need to return it also an integer. So the integer we return is going to be the integer 0. You could, for example, return the integer 56 or any other integer, but usually people just put 0. Again, that does not have any dramatic effect on what your actual program is going to do. So for example, if I want to give this program a run, all I need to do is, for example, do Control F5, and that's going to run your program. So once it runs your program, then it's going to open another window on top of it. As long as your program does not have any errors, which you usually are able to see down here in the by default bottom left area of your window, you should see this black console box by default, which is going to be showing you the output of your program. Obviously, our program is not doing anything because, as you can see, our main function just has, for example, it's just going to open the program, and then it's going to return absolutely nothing to us, i.e. return 0, right? So when you run the program, notice that it doesn't do anything, but usually it says something like press any key to close the window, and then once you press that key, it's going to close the window. But as long as it does those things with this basic structure layout, that means you are ready to start coding your very first C++ program. So the very first thing that I want for us to do is to display something to our user once we write our program. Typically, a lot of people usually show hello world as their first text, and that is perfectly okay, but you can literally display anything, hopefully appropriate to your user, once they've run your program. So in order to display something in the default manner in C++, you need a function that sort of tells the computer to display it on your screen. So there's a library of several different functions, and display is going to be one of them, and this library is called the iostream library. So to include the iostream library, you need to do hashtag include left brace iostream. So the, again, iostream library is going to be having your display and also input commands that we're going to be using for the beginning series of C++ programming, but later on we're going to be defining our own, so we don't have to sort of include this large library that has both what we want and other things that we do not want along with it, but it's going to get the job done at least to start. So the function that displays things to the user is the function std, which is short for standard, cout, so that's going to be displaying something out to the user, and then to display it there's going to be two left arrows, and then double quote, and then whatever you want to display to your user. And it's very important that at the end of this line you put a semicolon. Oftentimes when you have an error within a C++ program, sometimes it's as basic as forgetting a semicolon. Right, so the purpose of this program, let's sort of go through that again, is so for example, standard cout is the standard way of displaying something to your user in the console window, C for console, out for display, std for standard, that's the standard way of telling the computer to display something to your user, and this function cout is located in the iostream library, and hello world is going to be what it's going to display, and all of the text located within the double quotes is going to be displayed to your user. So let's just make sure that this does not have any errors, so control F5 that. And then once you have this type of environment, then you're going to see that we have build, 1 succeeded, 0 failed, which is a very good thing. So if we look at our particular window, notice that it does say hello world, and then it again asks us press any key to close this window, which is what we intended for this program to do. So if we just close that, at least we have a peace of mind that we have actually written our first basic C++ program. The next thing I want to do is slightly modify this to make it a little bit more easier to read on the output side of things. So again, if we control F5 this program, we already know that this program is going to run quite nicely, but notice that after hello world, it immediately jumps to the default output that the compiler is going to give us for our program. Suppose we want at least one or two lines after that line that sort of creates a division of the display. So what I want to do is I want to create a blank line after hello world. So in order to do that, what I need to do is go back to our console, and after the double quote, I'm going to again display another output, in particular the end of the line command. So to do that, I'm going to do again standard colon endl, which is going to be short for end line. So once I actually run this program, it should do the same exact thing, but instead, after hello world, it's going to display an empty line of text, i.e. it's going to go to the next line. So if I go to the next line, it's possible that I can actually start typing other things to display to our user. For example, let us assume that on the second line, and it's usually good practice to have these things aligned in the same exact column, I could, for example, say, how are you doing today? And again, don't forget the semicolon, and let's just give that a quick run. So always make sure, especially if you're a new programmer, run your code in small chunks so that it's easier to find your errors when you have them. So notice that again, let's sort of review what we have here so far. So the first is we have our hello world command. which is going to display hello world to our user, and then we go to our next line via the standard endl command, which again, endl is located in the iostream library. And then on the next line that we have, we're going to display to our user, how are you doing today? And of course, we can go to the next line as well. Now, there is another way of displaying or going to the next line. You could do, for example, \n, and that will actually be an alternative way of going to the next line, which is sometimes a little bit more nicer rather than calling the standard endl function from the iostream library. So for example, this is going to go to the next line, and for example, I can go to the next line and display something else, and you can sort of see that this will not be on the same line as line 2. And I can say, I hope you are doing well, for example, smiley face, and let's assume I want 2 blank lines after it. I can do \n, and that's going to give 2 empty lines right after it before the default output from my compiler. So notice I have semicolons at the end of each of these things, and \n is just an alternative for arrow standard endl command in the iostream library. So let's just give this a run just to make sure everything is working completely smoothly. So we have hello world on line 1, how are you doing today on line 2, I hope you're doing well on line 3, and 2 empty lines on line 4 and line 5 because we're not displaying anything on there. So if I were to have a cout command in my coding line 8, then that's going to appear on line 5 of my console window. Let's assume that you want to add a couple more lines of text. For example, let us assume I want to display after my hello world, how are you today? I hope you're doing well, first 3 lines, and then I have example, an empty line, and then another new line. I want to start displaying to my user what my favorite foods are. So on the next line I have that my favorite foods are, and then I go to the next line, and then I go to the next line and say, okay, my first favorite food is strawberry, my second line watermelon, and my next line peach, and then I have 2 empty lines below that. Notice that I have this white space located within inside my double quotes of my cout function. Every space that you put on the insides of double quotes of cout, it will display that in the output of your program. So if I give this a run, Control F5, that's going to display the spaces that you have inside of your double quotes. If you do not have those spaces in your double quotes, for example, if you put the double quote, the spaces, for example here, it's not going to come out on the outside of your program. So keep in mind, white space on the outside of your code doesn't have any effect aside from will it compile or not, but on the inside of your double quotes, that's where it does make a difference. Now, sometimes putting these spaces in this fashion is not quite nice because what we're doing is we're sort of tabbing these things a little bit forward. So an alternative of putting just a bunch of spaces there, what you can do is similar to \n going into the new line, \t will tab forward once. Now, this amount of space that the tab will tab forward is already predefined. You can redefine how many spaces tab will do, but we'll get into the advanced character literals a little bit later on in this series. So if I give this a run, it will produce the same exact output as before with a tab before strawberry, watermelon, and peach, which it indeed does over here. Another thing that you may be wondering is that when we write out, for example, cout and endl, we always have to precede that with standard : : That is, this is the standard way of naming these particular functions. If you have a common convention of naming a bunch of functions, usually what we would like to do is call what is called a namespace, which is just a shorthand fancy way of saying this is the naming convention that we're going to be using for this class of functions. So in order to just remove this std : what we can call is, for example, using namespace, So what we are doing is we're using a particular naming convention for some set of functions, and we're going to be using the standard library for namespacing. So everywhere you see this std colon colon, we can actually remove it because the using namespace standard or using the standard namespace actually tells our compiler that everywhere we see, for example, cout and endl and other functions that are located in the iostream library, we're not going to be using the standard function. Now, once we get into larger programs, where we might be using the cout or endl functions in other ways, you probably do not want to just be using the namespace because sometimes those functions do get confused with one another. So if we give this a run, it should run the same exact way. The only difference is the coding side of things, where this code is a lot more easier to read and a lot more easier to write as well, right? Because if you do not have this using namespace standard line here, then you are required to have the standard colon colon precede your cout and your endl functions. But if you are using the standard namespace, then all functions located in the iostream, or at least most of them, do not need to be preceded with the standard colon colon, which is called the resolution operator, for those particular functions, right? So this is definitely a more convenient way of writing these codes. Now, notice that we are using the cout and the endl functions inside of the main function, but we are using or calling the using namespace standard function outside of our main function. Although this does not have any big effect on our small little function, once we have other functions and declarations and definitions and classes and structures outside of our main function, it's usually not good practice to have it located outside because we might not be using the standard namespace outside of the main function. So in order to avoid having this using namespace standard affect things outside of our main function, what we could do is just place that inside of our main function above this particular library. And here, if I were to, for example, cout something outside of this main program in whatever way that is appropriate from the coding perspective, it will not be affected using the namespace standard library. For example, I would have to do, for example, standard colon colon cout in order to use the cout function if using namespace std is not displayed above. But if I have the namespace standard called, then I do not need to use the standard colon colon underneath that call of the namespace standard. More in particular, the standard namespace has other things defined in it, not just standard cout and standard cl. So instead of calling the entire standard namespace, you can actually just call the individual standard namespace subclassifiers that are used in this general namespace. For example, we can just say, okay, we're using the standard namespace for the cout command, and we're using the standard namespace for the endl command, right? So this also will run the same exact program with no error. And if we control F5, we will see that this still will work perfectly fine as intended. But here we're not using or we're not saving or using up any memory to represent all of the other things that we can sort of use that standard colon colon suppression predecessor for whatever functions that we're actually not using for our program. Here we're just saying, okay, we're using the namespace as standard for cout, we're using the standard namespace for endl, and we're not reserving any other memory or calling any other things in our standard namespace. So this is definitely a lot more cleaner, more efficient, definitely more practical from the coding perspective. And notice, since we already know how to go to a new line without the endl command, I can actually just remove this endl command, and then I can just put a \n because we know that that actually is going to do the same exact thing in this context. So technically we only need the standard cout resolution command, and we can actually just remove the standard endl statement. And this is practically the simplest or most compact way of writing what we have in our particular program. So those are some of the main things that you definitely should understand as we begin this journey of C++ programming. Of course, the syntax may be a little intimidating at first, but just remember, make sure you have semicolons at the end of all appropriate things. Notice, for example, that at the end of the int main function, there's not a semicolon, and at the beginning of the function, there's an open brace. At the end of the function, there's a closed brace. But at the end of all of these other lines, we do have a semicolon. No semicolon at the include iostream. So definitely there are some syntax things that you definitely should keep aware of, but overall those are some of the basics that you definitely should know before we begin this journey of C++ programming. So I'll see you in the next video. I hope you enjoyed. Take care.